Daniel Whitmore grabbed the divorce papers and threw them across the desk so hard they scattered onto the floor at Claire's feet. Then he leaned forward, both fists pressed into the glass surface, and looked down at his wife of 7 years like she was something he had already stepped over. "Pick them up," he said. "Sign them, and get out of my building." He didn't wait for her to respond. He turned back to his phone call, waving one hand at her, a single dismissive flick of the wrist, like she was a fly he had already forgotten about. She was worth more than everything he had ever built. He had absolutely no idea. If you've ever been underestimated by someone who thought they knew your worth, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel, follow Claire's story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The morning Daniel Whitmore decided to end his marriage, he wore his best suit. That was the detail that stayed with people afterward. The ones who knew him, the ones who worked for him, the ones who eventually watched everything fall apart. He had chosen his charcoal gray Armani, the one he saved for board meetings and important dinners, the one he wore when he wanted to remind the room who he was. He took his time with the cufflinks. He checked his reflection twice. He treated ending his 7-year marriage like a business meeting he intended to win. Claire Bennett had been awake since 5 that morning. She had not slept well. She rarely slept well anymore, but this particular morning she had woken up with a feeling she could not name, a heaviness in her chest that sat just below her ribs and refused to move. She made coffee the way she always did, 2 cups out of habit, and then she stood in the kitchen of the apartment she and Daniel shared and looked at the second cup steaming on the counter and thought with a strange calm that she already knew something was ending. She had known for a while. She just hadn't let herself say it out loud. She was wearing a pale blue sweater that had gone soft from too many washes and a pair of dark slacks that she had owned for 3 years. Her hair was pulled back simply. She was not wearing makeup. When Daniel walked into the kitchen that morning, briefcase already in hand, and told her she needed to come to his office at 11 o'clock because there were papers to sign, he looked at her the way a person looks at furniture they have already decided to replace. "What kind of papers?" she asked. I was already heading for the door. "I'll explain when you get there. Just be on time for once." She had never been late for anything in her life, but she didn't say that. She just watched the door close behind him and picked up her coffee and drank it slowly, standing at the window, watching the Chicago morning unfold beneath her. She was 34 years old. She had been with Daniel since she was 26, first as the quiet woman who believed in him when his first company was failing, then as his wife, then as the invisible background presence that kept his life organized and smooth, while he built the version of himself he had always wanted to become. She had cooked and managed and supported and waited. She had worn modest clothes and driven an ordinary car and smiled at his colleagues' wives, even when they looked at her like she was a mistake he had made and not yet corrected. She had done all of this deliberately. She had done all of this because she wanted something real. What Daniel did not know, what he had never been allowed to know, was that Claire Bennett had never needed a single thing he had to offer. She had simply wanted to find out if he was worth loving. Daniel's office was on the 32nd floor of a building in the Loop that had his company's name on the side. Whitmore Capital Solutions. He had named it himself. He was proud of that in a way that always made Claire feel a little sad, though she could never fully explain why. She took the elevator up at exactly 11 o'clock, told the receptionist, a young woman named April, who had always been kind to Claire in a careful, guilty sort of way, that she had an appointment and was shown into his office without any waiting. Daniel was standing behind his desk when she walked in. The divorce papers were already there, centered on the glass surface, like he had placed them with a ruler. There was a pen laid beside them. He had prepared for this. He had set the stage. He didn't greet her. He gestured at the chair across from him like he was directing an employee. "Sit down." Claire sat. She folded her hands in her lap and looked at the papers, and then looked at him and waited. He sat down too slowly, leaning back in his chair with the confidence of a man who believed every inch of the room belonged to him, which she supposed it did. "I think we both know this hasn't been working for a long time," he said. "Do we?" she said quietly. He blinked just slightly. He hadn't expected her to push back even gently. "Claire, don't make this difficult." "I'm not making anything difficult. I just asked a question." "The marriage is over," he said, and his voice had that particular flatness. She had learned to recognize the tone he used when he had already made a decision and was merely presenting it as a formality. "I've had the papers drawn up, Everything is straightforward. You'll be taken care of. There's a settlement." He paused, and something moved across his face, not guilt exactly, more like the minor inconvenience of guilt. "It's generous, considering." "Considering what?" she asked. He spread his hands slightly. "Considering that you didn't exactly bring much to the table." The silence that followed was not empty. It was very, very full. Claire looked at him. She looked at him for a long moment, at the expensive suit, at the practiced ease in his posture, at the way he had arranged his face into an expression of reasonable, blameless authority, and she felt something she had not expected to feel in that moment. She felt sorry for him. Not the condescending kind of sorry, the real kind. The kind that comes when you watch someone reveal themselves completely and understand that they have no idea what they've just shown you. "You really believe that?" she said softly. "Believe what? That I didn't bring anything to the table?" He exhaled through his nose, the sound of a man managing his patience. "Claire, you've been a good wife, in your way, but we both know you never had ambitions. You never built anything. You've been comfortable, and I've given you that comfort, and now I need to move forward with someone who—" He stopped. He caught himself, but not fast enough. "Someone who what?" she said. He picked up the pen and held it out to her. "Just sign the papers." She looked at the pen. She looked at the papers. She thought about 7 years. She thought about the nights she had stayed up waiting for him to come home, the weekends she had spent alone, the dinners where she had smiled and deflected questions about herself, and made sure every conversation circled back to Daniel and his company and his ambitions. She thought about how carefully she had built the life of an ordinary woman, how convincingly she had played that role, how much of herself she had folded away to make room for someone she had believed for a very long time was worth the effort. She thought about this morning she had found the emails, 3 weeks ago, his laptop open on the kitchen counter, a name she didn't recognize, messages that were not about business. She had closed the laptop and made breakfast and not said a single word. She reached out and took the pen. Daniel smiled. It was the smile of a man who had gotten what he wanted with less effort than expected. "Thank you," he said, and there was something in his voice, a relief so visible it was almost ugly. "This is the right thing, for both of us." Claire pressed the pen to the paper. She signed her name in her clean, careful handwriting. She put the pen down. Then she looked up at him, and the expression on her face was one he would think about for a very long time afterward. Not angry, not hurt, not even particularly sad. Just clear, like a woman who has just made a decision she is completely at peace with. "You're going to want to remember this moment," she said. He laughed, the contemptuous full laugh she would hear in her memory for weeks. "Is that a threat?" "No," she said, and she picked up her bag and stood. "It's just that people usually do. Remember the moment everything changed." She paused at the door. "Good luck with your deal, Daniel." She walked out. She did not look back. In the elevator going down, Claire did something she had not permitted herself to do in a very long time. She took out her phone and dialed a number that had a different country code prefix, a number she had kept in her contacts under a name that meant nothing to anyone who might see it. It rang twice. "Miss Bennett?" said the voice on the other end. Not Mrs. Whitmore, Miss Bennett, as if the last 7 years had been a brief detour and she had simply returned to herself. "We've been expecting your call." "I know," she said. "I need you to start making arrangements." "Of course. Should we prepare the full portfolio review or—" "Everything," she said quietly. "I want everything ready. And Marcus." She paused. The elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened onto the marble foyer of Daniel's building. "Pull up whatever we have on Whitmore Capital Solutions. All of it." "Yes, Miss Bennett." She hung up and walked through the lobby and out into the Chicago morning and did not stop walking until she was half a block away, standing on the sidewalk with the city moving around her, and only then did she stop and press her hand flat against the front of her coat over her sternum and breathe. Just breathe. She had not cried. She did not intend to. Not because she wasn't in pain, she was in the specific and complicated way you are in pain when you finally accept that someone was never who you hoped they were, but because she had learned a long time ago that some moments deserve clarity more than tears. She flagged a cab. She gave an address on the North Shore that the driver recognized immediately, the kind of address that made him glance at her in the rearview mirror with slight recalibration, looking at her simple sweater and her ordinary bag, and revising some assumption he had made. She didn't notice, or if she did, she didn't care. Back on the 32nd floor, Daniel was already on the phone. "It's done," he said. He was smiling. He was standing at his window looking out at the skyline the way he always did when things were going his way, like the city was a confirmation of something. She signed. No drama, no argument. Easier than I expected, honestly. The voice on the other end was his business partner, Greg Halston, a man 10 years older than Daniel, with the particular energy of someone who had made most of his money off other people's recklessness, and had learned to disguise that fact behind a very practiced friendliness. "She didn't fight it," Greg said. "Not at all. She said something a little strange at the end, but you know Claire." He waved his hand dismissively at the window. "She never really understood how any of this works." "Well," said Greg, and Daniel could hear him smiling through the phone, "then we can move forward. We can absolutely move forward. The meeting with the Nexum Group is Thursday. If their investment comes through the way I think it will, we're looking at a 12-figure deal, Daniel. That kind of money changes everything." Daniel pressed his fingertips against the glass of the window. He looked at his own reflection, and behind it the city. "I know," he said. "I know exactly what it changes." After he hung up, his assistant knocked and entered with a coffee and his afternoon schedule. She was 29 and very polished and laughed at everything he said. He accepted the coffee and thanked her with a warmth he had not used in years, and she smiled on her way out, and Daniel Whitmore felt for the first time in what seemed like a long time that his life was finally aligning exactly the way he had always intended. He did not think about Claire again until Thursday. She had grown up understanding something that most people spend their entire lives trying to learn, that money at a certain scale becomes almost fictional. Not in the sense that it isn't real, it is brutally real, it shapes everything, it moves governments and builds cities and ends careers, but in the sense that it stops feeling like the coins and bills that most people understand and becomes something more like weather. Something enormous and impersonal that surrounds everything, and that most people only experience the edges of. The Bennett family had been living inside that weather for 4 generations. Claire's great-grandfather had been a railroad man in the early 20th century who had understood before almost anyone else that the real value of railroads was not the trains, but the land beneath the tracks and the towns that grew up around the stations. He had bought land, extraordinary amounts of it, quietly, methodically, without fanfare. When people eventually understood what he had done, it was too late to replicate it. The land had already become something else. Cities, ports, industrial corridors. His son had taken that foundation and moved into banking before banking was fashionable. His granddaughter, Claire's mother, had taken those assets and restructured them into a trust so complex and deliberately obscure that it had taken the most sophisticated financial journalists in the country 3 separate attempts over 15 years to even partially map it. Each attempt had been incomplete. That was by design. The Bennett Legacy Trust was not a public entity. It was not listed anywhere. It did not have a headquarters that appeared on any official registry. It had a managing director, a man named Marcus Webb, who had worked for the family since before Claire was born, and it had a legal team and a financial team and a network of subsidiary companies so elaborate that even the people inside it only ever saw their own small corner. And it had an heir. Claire had inherited the trust at the age of 25 upon the death of her mother in a private ceremony that consisted of 3 lawyers, Marcus Webb, and a document 12 inches thick. She had sat at the table in a building in Geneva that most people walked past every day without ever wondering what happened inside it. And she had signed her name, the same clean, careful handwriting she would use years later in Daniel's office. And she had become officially and irrevocably the controlling interest of a financial empire that made most billionaires look like they were doing well for themselves. She had been 25. She had been in the middle of her 2nd year of graduate school in Chicago. She had been at that moment dating a man who was charming and ambitious and believed in himself with a conviction that she had found at 25 genuinely exciting. She had decided in the weeks after her mother's death and her inheritance of something so large it barely had edges that she wanted to know something. She wanted to know if Daniel Whitmore, or any version of Daniel Whitmore, any person who had that particular quality of believing the world owed them something wonderful, would choose her if she had nothing. If she had nothing, would she still be chosen? So she had hidden it, all of it. She had told Daniel early in their relationship that her parents had left her a small inheritance, a modest amount, just enough to be comfortable. He had nodded with the brief, incurious interest of someone hearing information that doesn't particularly affect them. She had kept her life deliberately ordinary, the modest apartment before they married, the average car, the simple clothes. She had been careful. She had been patient. And for a few years, when Daniel's company was still young and struggling, and he would come home exhausted and grateful and hold on to her like she was the one solid thing in his life during those years, she had believed the experiment had produced a beautiful result. She had been wrong. Marcus Webb was 61 years old and had the particular quality that the very best financial minds develop over long careers of managing extraordinary amounts of other people's money. He was almost perfectly unreadable. His face was pleasant and professionally warm and revealed nothing except what he chose to reveal, and he had long ago stopped choosing to reveal anything of interest to anyone he didn't fully trust. He trusted Claire. He had watched her grow up. He had watched her make this decision, the deliberate ordinariness, the marriage, the years of patience with the same expression he used for most things, a careful, watchful neutrality that was not disapproval, but was not quite approval either. He was in Chicago by the following Monday. They met in a building near Millennium Park that appeared from the outside to be a mid-size architectural firm. The lobby matched that impression. The elevator, accessible only with a specific code, did not. "I want a complete picture," Claire said. She was sitting across from him at a table that was bare, except for a single closed folder. She had not opened it. "What do we know about Whitmore Capital Solutions?" Marcus placed his hands flat on the table. He had the posture of a man preparing to deliver information he wishes were different. "The company is in significant trouble," he said. "The public filings suggest growth, but the internal numbers—" He paused. "We have sources, Miss Bennett, that indicate the internal numbers are very different from the public filings." She looked at him steadily. "How different?" "There is a pattern of what I would describe carefully as creative accounting. Several institutional investors have been given projections that don't correspond to the actual performance data. It is possible that some of this is simply optimistic interpretation. It is also possible," another pause, "that it is something more deliberate." Claire absorbed this. She had known something was wrong. She had caught enough fragments over the years, overheard conversations, unusual tension around certain periods. Daniel's occasional insistence on handling certain things himself rather than through proper channels. She had noticed. She had catalogued. She had told herself each time that she might be wrong. She had not been wrong. "How many people are affected," she asked, "if this comes apart?" "The company employs 412 people. Many of them are invested in the company's performance through stock options and pension structures that are," he looked at the folder, "significantly exposed. 412 people." She pressed her hands flat on her thighs beneath the table. "And the Nexum deal." Marcus looked at her with an expression that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it, the look of a man recalibrating his estimate of how much she already knew. "You're aware of it?" "I heard the name mentioned. Tell me what it actually is." He opened the folder for the first time and turned it toward her. "Nexum Global Partners is a private investment consortium. They have been in discussion with Whitmore Capital Solutions about a major capital injection. The figures we have seen range between $800 million and $1.2 billion. He tapped a specific document. "They are scheduled to meet on Thursday." Claire looked at the document. She looked at the numbers. Something moved in her chest. Not anger exactly. Something colder and more precise than anger. "Who owns Nexum?" she said quietly. Marcus almost smiled. "That," he said, "is an excellent question. And the answer is that Nexum Global Partners is a subsidiary of a holding company called Ariel Investments International, which is itself a subsidiary of—" He paused with the careful timing of a man who has practiced this disclosure. "Of the Bennett Legacy Trust," Claire finished. "Yes," said Marcus. The room was very quiet. "So," she said. "So," he agreed. "The investment consortium that Daniel Whitmore is meeting with on Thursday to save his company," she said slowly, like she was hearing herself say it and testing whether it was real, "is ultimately controlled by me." "Correct," she breathed out. She looked at the ceiling for a moment. She looked back at Marcus. "He has no idea." "No." She was quiet for a long time, long enough that Marcus, who was not a man who grew anxious, easily began to watch her with something approaching concern. "Miss Bennett," he said, "What would you like to do?" She looked at him, and the expression on her face was the same one she had worn in Daniel's office, that clear, still completely settled expression. The look of a woman who has arrived somewhere she has been walking toward for a very long time. "I want to understand everything about this deal before Thursday," she said. "Every investor, every promise he's made, every document. I want to understand exactly how exposed those 400 employees are and what it would take to protect them." She paused. "And then I want to be in the room." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "In the Nexum meeting?" "Yes. And Mr. Whitmore, he'll know I'm there when I'm there," she said simply. "Not before." She spent the following 3 days working. Not the performance of work she had done in her marriage, the careful management of appearances, the maintenance of an ordinary life. This was the work she had been built for, the thing she was actually genuinely good at, in a way that she had been hiding for so long it felt like stretching muscles she hadn't used in years. She read everything. She absorbed data with the particular quality of attention that her mother had always called the family gift. Not just seeing numbers, but understanding what they meant, what they were hiding, what the gaps between them implied. She had 3 conversations with the heads of the trust's financial and legal divisions late at night in conference calls that lasted hours. She asked questions that made people at the other end of the line, people who dealt in 9-figure decisions for a living, occasionally pause and say quietly, and with genuine respect, "That's exactly the right question." She thought about Daniel at odd moments, not with the grief she had expected, but with something more complicated, a kind of accumulated tiredness. She thought about the version of him she had married, the one who had come home uncertain and grateful and held on to her, and she thought about the version who had placed the divorce papers on his desk like she was a business problem. He was solving, and she wondered when exactly the distance between those 2 men had become unbridgeable, and whether she had missed the moment, or whether the moment had simply never existed, whether the grateful, uncertain man had always been the performance, and this had always been underneath. She thought about the 412 people. That was what she kept coming back to. Not the money was so abstract it barely registered. But 412 people who had gone to work every day believing that the numbers meant what they were told. They meant that the stock options their retirement depended on were real, that the company they had given years of their lives to was what it claimed to be. Those people had not signed divorce papers. Those people had not had any choice at all. On Wednesday night, she sat alone in the suite she had taken at a hotel that did not have her name on the reservation, and she looked out at the Chicago skyline that she had looked at for 7 years, from windows that were never really hers. And she thought about Thursday. She thought about walking into that room. She thought about Daniel's face. She picked up her phone and called Marcus. "Everything's ready," he said before she could ask. "Good," she said. "Miss Bennett," he said, and there was something in his voice, a careful warmth, that he allowed himself very rarely. "Your mother would have handled this the same way." She held the phone against her ear and looked at the city. "I know," she said quietly. "That's what I'm most afraid of." She didn't explain what she meant by that, and Marcus, who understood her better than almost anyone, did not ask. She hung up and sat in the dark and thought about what it meant to have power, real power, the kind that doesn't need to announce itself, and what she intended to do with it, and whether she was the person she hoped she was. Thursday was 12 hours away. She closed her eyes. She had been preparing for this her entire life. Daniel Whitmore woke up the morning after the divorce, feeling like a man who had just won something. He stretched in the king-size bed of his downtown apartment, the one he had already moved most of his things into 3 weeks before the papers were signed, the one that felt like a reward he had been promising himself, and he stared at the ceiling with the particular satisfaction of a person who has been carrying a weight for a long time and has finally put it down. He picked up his phone before his feet hit the floor. 17 messages, 3 from Greg, 2 from the PR firm they used for investor relations, 1 from his assistant confirming Thursday's meeting with the Nexum Group. He read them in order quickly, the way he read everything, scanning for what mattered, skipping what didn't. Nothing from Claire. He hadn't expected anything from Claire, but there was a small part of him, a part he would have refused to acknowledge out loud, that had half anticipated some kind of response. A message, a phone call, some evidence that she had gone home and fallen apart the way he had privately assumed she would. Nothing. He put the phone down. He got up. He made himself coffee with the expensive machine he had bought when he moved in, and he stood at the window in his robe and looked at the city and told himself the silence meant she had accepted it cleanly, that it had gone as well as these things could go, that he had handled it with more decency than most men would have. He was very good at telling himself the story he needed to hear. His phone buzzed. Greg. He answered on the second ring. "You sound awake," Greg said. "I am awake." "Good, because I just got off the phone with Hartwell from the Nexum side, and I think Thursday is going to be bigger than we thought." Greg had a particular energy when he smelled money, a brightness in his voice that he couldn't quite contain, like carbonation. They're not just looking at the capital injection anymore. There's talk of a full acquisition pathway. If this goes the way Hartwell is suggesting, we are talking about something that puts you in a completely different category, Daniel. Daniel set his coffee down on the counter. How different? The kind of different that means you never have to worry about anything again. Ever. A pause for emphasis. The kind of different that makes everything you've built look like the first chapter. Daniel was quiet for a moment. He looked at the city. He thought about Thursday. He thought about sitting across a table from a group of people who controlled that kind of money and having them decide that he was worth it, that his company, his vision, his name was worth that kind of commitment. "We need to be perfect Thursday," he said. "We will be," Greg said. "Trust me." After he hung up, Daniel showered and dressed with more care than usual. He was already thinking past the divorce, past Claire, past all of it. He was thinking about what came next. He was thinking about the version of his life that started now. He did not think about the expression on Claire's face when she walked out of his office. The clear, still completely settled expression that had made him just for a fraction of a second feel something he refused to examine. He put that away. I had a meeting to prepare for. Claire was already 3 moves ahead of him by the time he finished his second cup of coffee. She had been in the building near Millennium Park since 8 in the morning, sitting across from Marcus Webb and 2 members of the Trust's legal team working through documents with the focused intensity of a person who has stopped performing patients and started operating at full capacity. The legal team, a man named Richard Holt, who had done corporate law for 30 years, and a woman named Priya Sato, who had joined the trust 5 years ago and was widely considered to be one of the sharpest minds in private financial litigation, had both been briefed on the situation. Both had arrived prepared. Both were watching Claire with the particular attention that very competent people give to someone they are newly understanding is operating above the level they had assumed. "Walk me through the exposure structure one more time," Claire said, looking at Priya. "Specifically, the employee pension positions." Priya pulled a document forward. Of the 412 employees, roughly 280 have some portion of their retirement savings in company stock through the internal pension program. The program was structured, and this is where it gets complicated, with a cliff vesting schedule that means anyone who has been with the company fewer than 5 years would lose a significant portion of their investment if the company's valuation dropped below a certain threshold. "What threshold?" Priya looked at her directly. "The threshold that Whitmore Capital Solutions is currently sitting approximately 8% above." Claire absorbed this without moving. "And if the Nexum deal falls through, or if the internal accounting problems become public before the deal closes, then the valuation drops, the cliff triggers, and a significant number of employees who have been contributing to that pension program for between 2 and 4 years lose." Priya paused, and something in her voice shifted, became less technical and more human. "They lose what they've been building toward." The room was quiet. Richard cleared his throat. "There is also the matter of the institutional investors. 11 separate investment entities have positions in Whitmore Capital that are based on projections we believe to be materially misleading. If those projections are presented to the Nexum Group on Thursday as factual," he paused carefully, "there are legal implications that go beyond financial loss." "You're talking about fraud," Claire said. Richard adjusted his glasses. "I'm talking about a situation that has the potential to be characterized as fraud by a sufficiently motivated prosecutor. Yes." Claire stood up. She walked to the window. She stood there with her back to the room, and the 2 lawyers exchanged a glance that was brief and communicative. The glance of 2 people silently agreeing that they are in the presence of something they hadn't quite expected. "I want to be clear about something," Claire said, still facing the window. "I am not doing this to destroy him." Marcus, who was sitting quietly at the end of the table, said nothing. He simply watched her. "I want those employees protected," she continued. "I want the pension exposure covered before anything else happens. I want the investors who were given false information to be made whole. And I want whoever is responsible for creating those misleading projections to have a very honest conversation with people who know what to do with that information." She paused. "In that order. The order matters." "And Mr. Whitmore?" Richard asked carefully. She turned around. "Daniel made his choices. He'll live with the consequences of his choices. But those 400 people didn't make any choices. They just went to work." She looked at Richard, then Priya, then Marcus. "We protect the people who didn't have any say first. Everything else comes after." Priya Sato, who had worked in financial litigation for 9 years and had seen a remarkable variety of human behavior in rooms, exactly like this one, looked at Claire Bennett and felt something she did not feel very often in her professional life. She felt like she was watching someone do the right thing, not as a strategy, not as a calculation, just the right thing. "Understood," she said quietly. "Good," said Claire. "Then let's talk about Thursday." Greg Halston was in Daniel's office by 11 that morning, and the first thing he did was close the door. Daniel noticed. Greg almost never closed the door. "What?" Daniel said. Greg sat down across from him and placed a file folder on the desk. It was thinner than Daniel expected, which was somehow more alarming than if it had been thick. A thick folder meant information. A thin folder meant someone had decided carefully what to include. "I had our due diligence people take a second look at the Nexum side," Greg said, "to make sure we understood who we were actually dealing with." And Greg opened the folder and pushed it across the desk. "Nexum Global Partners is a real entity. The money is real. The people representing them at the meeting on Thursday are legitimate." He tapped the edge of the folder. "But the ownership structure goes deeper than what they initially disclosed to us. It's layered. Several holding companies, some international entities." Daniel looked at the documents in the folder. They were dense with corporate structures, chain of ownership diagrams, subsidiary relationships. I was good with numbers and documents, but this was deliberately complex in a way that made his eyes slide. "Bottom line it for me," he said. Greg leaned forward. "We can't find the end of the chain. Our people followed it through 3 jurisdictions and then hit a wall. A private trust structure that isn't publicly registered anywhere." He paused. "That's not necessarily unusual at this level of money. A lot of very wealthy entities prefer that kind of opacity. But I want to make sure we're going into Thursday with our eyes open." Daniel looked at him. "You think this is a problem?" "I think it's a question mark," Greg said carefully. "And I don't like question marks going into a meeting this important. But the money is real. The money is real. Then we go in Thursday." Daniel pushed the folder back across the desk. "Mystery ownership is practically a status symbol at this level. It means the money has been around long enough to need protecting." Greg looked at him for a moment, the particular look of a man who has a further concern he is deciding whether to voice. Then he picked up the folder and stood. "There's one more thing," he said. "What?" Greg paused at the door. He had his hand on the knob, and he was not quite facing Daniel, and there was something in his body language, a tightening, a reluctance that Daniel had not seen from him before. "The pension fund report," Greg said. "The one you asked me to handle the restructuring on about 8 months ago." Daniel kept his face perfectly neutral. "What about it?" "The way it was restructured." Greg stopped, started again. "I've been thinking about it. With Nexum coming in with the level of scrutiny that a deal of this size brings." Another stop. "I just think we should make sure our documentation is airtight before Thursday." The air between them had changed. Just slightly. Just enough. "Our documentation is fine," Daniel said. His voice was level, controlled. The voice of a man who has had a great deal of practice being controlled. Everything was handled through proper channels. Greg looked at him fully for the first time since he had closed the door. "Was it—" The silence lasted 3 seconds. Maybe 4. "Close the door on your way out, Greg," Daniel said. Greg left. He closed the door. Daniel sat very still behind his desk for a long moment, and then he opened his laptop and navigated to a specific folder and looked at a specific set of documents for a long time without moving. His coffee went cold. She didn't tell anyone where she was going that afternoon. She took a car to a neighborhood on the west side of the city, a working-class neighborhood, the kind where the buildings were older and the streets were louder, and the people moved with the particular purposefulness of people who don't have extra time. She had an address written on a piece of paper, though she had memorized it 2 days ago. The address was for a woman named Sandra Torres. Sandra Torres was 47 years old. She had worked at Whitmore Capital Solutions for 4 years and 3 months as an administrative coordinator in the operations division. She had 2 teenage children. She had started contributing to the company pension program 18 months after she was hired because a coworker had told her it was the smart thing to do, that the company was growing, that the numbers were good, that this was the kind of opportunity you didn't pass up. She had increased her contribution twice. She had talked to her daughter about what the accumulation might mean in 15 years. Claire had not picked Sandra Torres at random. Sandra Torres had written an email to the company's HR department 6 weeks ago, expressing concern about changes to the pension structure that she didn't fully understand. The email had been acknowledged and then not answered. She had sent a follow-up. The follow-up had also not been answered. Claire stood outside the building where Sandra Torres lived and understood with great clarity why she had made the choices she had made in the last 48 hours. She rang the buzzer. Sandra Torres opened the door with the expression of someone who is accustomed to being sold things she doesn't want and intends to shut the door quickly. She was a compact woman with tired eyes and efficient posture and a dish towel over one shoulder, which meant she had been interrupted in the middle of something. "I'm not buying anything," Sandra said. "I'm not selling anything," Claire said. "My name is Claire. I work in—" She paused. This was the part she had thought carefully about. "I work in finance. I've been reviewing the pension structure at Whitmore Capital Solutions, and I understand you had some questions that didn't get answered." Sandra Torres looked at her for a long moment. The tired eyes sharpened with something that was not quite suspicion and not quite hope. "How do you know about that?" she said. "Because I've been paying attention," Claire said simply. "Can I have 10 minutes? Sandra Torres stepped back from the door. They sat at Sandra's kitchen table, which had 3 chairs and a collection of school papers spread across one end. Sandra had moved the papers without apology and put the kettle on without asking, which Claire appreciated both the lack of ceremony and the instinct toward hospitality. "So you're telling me my retirement savings could be at risk," Sandra said after Claire had explained the situation in plain language carefully without jargon. "I'm telling you there is a risk that I am working to prevent," Claire said. "I want to be accurate with you. The situation is not resolved yet, but I want you to know that someone is aware of it and that protecting the employees is the first priority." Sandra looked at her coffee mug. Then she looked up. "Who are you exactly?" "Someone who should have been paying attention sooner," Claire said. Sandra Torres had the particular quality of a person who has dealt with a lot of institutional runaround and has developed a very sensitive detector for whether the person in front of her is being straight with her. She looked at Claire for a long moment with that detector running at full power. "Are you going to fix it?" she said. "Yes," Claire said. "I'm going to fix it." "Because I've got 2 kids," Sandra said. Her voice didn't waver, but something in it compressed slightly, the controlled compression of someone holding something back. "And I've been putting money into that pension because someone told me it was safe. And if it turns out it wasn't safe and I lose it and nobody told me—" She stopped. She pressed her lips together. "I need to know that somebody in a position to do something actually gives a damn." Claire reached across the table and placed her hand briefly over Sandra's and then withdrew it. "I give a damn," she said. Sandra breathed out slowly. She looked at her coffee. She looked at the school papers at the other end of the table. "Okay," she said finally. "Okay." Walking out of that building, Claire pulled out her phone and called Marcus. "I need the pension protection structured as a priority," she said before he could speak. "Not contingent on anything else. Separate from the deal, separate from whatever happens Thursday. It needs to be guaranteed independently." "That's yes," Marcus said. "That's achievable. It will take some structural creativity, but whatever it takes," she said. "These people didn't sign up for someone else's risk. They thought they were building something safe." She walked back to her car. She sat in it for a moment before starting it. She thought about Sandra Torres's face when she said the word safe. The particular quality of that word in that context, the way it meant so much more than financial security. The way it meant I trusted someone. I did what I was supposed to do. I believed. Claire started the car. She had one more day before Thursday. Wednesday moved differently than she expected. Fast in some ways and in others strangely suspended. She had 3 conference calls before noon, one with the Trust's financial division, one with Richard Holt, about the legal documentation they would need, ready before the meeting, one with the Nexum side representatives, who knew exactly who she was and were without exception completely professional and completely prepared. She spent 2 hours reviewing the specific documents that Whitmore Capital Solutions had provided to the Nexum team during the preliminary discussions, the projections, the performance data, the growth charts. She read them twice. She read the real numbers 3 times. The gap between them was not ambiguous. It was not a matter of interpretation or optimistic modeling. It was a gap that had been deliberately constructed, that required active choice on multiple occasions to maintain, that had the fingerprints of at minimum 2 people who understood exactly what they were doing. One of those people was Greg Halston. She had not expected that. She had assumed it was Daniel's architecture alone. But the more she looked at the documentation, the clearer it became that Halston was not a passive participant. He was a co-author. She called Priya. "I see it," Priya said before Claire had finished explaining. "I flagged it this morning. The restructuring of the pension allocation that happened 8 months ago, Halston's signature is on the authorization documents." So they both knew. "It appears so." Claire pressed the heel of her hand against her sternum. She thought about Daniel in his office with the divorce papers. She thought about him laughing. She thought about him waving his hand at her, the dismissive flick of the wrist, like she was a fly he had already forgotten about. She thought about Sandra Torres saying, "I need to know that somebody in a position to do something actually gives a damn. What do we need to do to make sure those employees are fully protected before this meeting happens?" she said. "We need the trust to issue a guarantee structure tonight," Priya said. "An indemnification that sits independently of whatever happens to the company's valuation. If we can get that documentation signed and registered by tomorrow morning, then regardless of what comes out in the meeting, those 280 employees are covered." "Do it," Claire said. "It'll require your signature." "I know. Send me the documents." They arrived in her email 40 minutes later. She read every page. She signed every signature line. She sent them back. It was done by 9 o'clock that night. She sat in the hotel suite and looked at the Chicago skyline and thought about the fact that 412 people were going to wake up tomorrow and go to work and drink their coffee and do their jobs without knowing that the ground under their feet had just been made solid by someone they had never met. That was the thing about real power she was learning. The real kind, not the kind Daniel had been performing, not the kind that needed to announce itself in the way he arranged his office and wore his suit and laughed at his wife across a desk. The real kind was quiet. The real kind moved without making noise and built things without making speeches and protected people who never knew they needed protecting. Her phone buzzed. "Marcus." "Everything is registered," he said. "The guarantee structure is filed. It's done." "Thank you, Marcus." A pause. "You should sleep, Miss Bennett." "I know. You have a big day tomorrow." She almost smiled. "I know that too." She put the phone down. She looked at the city. She thought about Daniel in his apartment across town, reviewing his presentation for tomorrow's meeting, rehearsing his answers, checking the knot in his tie in the bathroom mirror, and feeling like a man who was about to win. She thought about the moment already less than 14 hours away when he would walk into that meeting room and see her face. She thought about what that moment would do to him. Not with satisfaction. Not exactly. With something more complicated and more honest than satisfaction. She had spent 7 years making herself invisible so that she could know something true. And what she had learned in the end was the truth she had most needed to know, not about Daniel, but about herself. She had learned that she was not willing to be invisible anymore, not for anyone, not for any reason, not ever again. She turned off the light. She slept better than she had in years. Daniel arrived at this building where the Nexum meeting was being held at 8:45 the following morning. The meeting was scheduled for 9. He was early, which was intentional. He always arrived first to important meetings. It was a small power move that he had read about in a book once, and adopted so thoroughly it had become instinct. He was wearing the charcoal gray Armani again, same suit he had worn to file the divorce papers. He had chosen it deliberately. He wanted to feel like a man who had already won. Greg met him in the lobby. Greg looked slightly less composed than usual. There were faint shadows under his eyes and a tightness around his mouth that he was working to conceal, and Daniel noted both things and said nothing about either. "Ready?" Daniel said. "Ready," Greg said. They took the elevator up together in silence. The building was the kind of building that communicated wealth without advertising it. The materials were expensive, the proportions were generous. Everything worked the way it was supposed to work without drawing attention to the fact that it was working. Daniel noticed all of this and felt confirmed by it. The meeting room was on the 14th floor. They were shown to it by a woman who did not introduce herself and did not need to. The room had a long table, floor-to-ceiling glass, and 3 people already seated on the far side. Daniel recognized 2 of them from the preliminary meetings, Hartwell and a woman named Diane Cross, who handled the analytical side for the Nexum team. The third was a man he didn't recognize, older, very still, the kind of still that comes from decades of rooms exactly like this one. "Mr. Whitmore," said Hartwell, standing. They shook hands. "Mr. Halston, thank you for coming." "Thank you for having us," Daniel said. He settled into his chair with the ease of a man who is comfortable in his own performance. "Before we begin," Hartwell said, "there's been a slight change to our side's representation this morning. An additional party will be joining us." He glanced at the door on the far side of the room. "She was reviewing some final documentation and will be with us momentarily." Daniel nodded. He looked at Greg. Greg was looking at his hands. The door opened, and Daniel Whitmore felt the floor drop out from under him. Claire walked in wearing a charcoal blazer and carrying a single leather folio, and she moved through the room with the complete quiet authority of a woman who has been in rooms like this one her entire life, who does not need to announce herself because the room already knows she is there. She did not look at Daniel when she entered. She sat down next to Hartwell, opened her folio, and said something quietly to the older man on her right, who nodded. Then she looked across the table, at Daniel. Their eyes met. She didn't smile. She didn't perform the moment. She just looked at him with that same clear, still settled expression he had seen when she walked out of his office 4 days ago. The expression of a woman who had told him exactly what was going to happen. Daniel's mouth opened, closed. He looked at Hartwell. He looked back at Claire. He said in a voice that had lost about 60% of its practiced confidence, "What is she doing here?" Hartwell looked mildly surprised by the question. "Ms. Bennett is the controlling interest of the Bennett Legacy Trust," he said with the careful neutrality of a man who finds the question slightly strange. "The trust is the primary backer of the Nexum Group." He paused. "She's here because she owns it." The silence that followed was the loudest silence Daniel Whitmore had ever sat inside. Greg Halston beside him said absolutely nothing. He was looking at the table. Claire picked up her pen. She looked at the documents in front of her. She said without looking up in a voice that was perfectly calm and perfectly civil, and somehow more devastating than any anger would have been. "Shall we begin?" The first 10 seconds after Claire said, "Shall we begin?" were the longest 10 seconds of Daniel Whitmore's professional life. He sat very still. He was good at sitting still. He had trained himself over years of difficult meetings and uncomfortable negotiations to keep his face from doing anything his brain hadn't authorized. But this was a different kind of still, not the controlled stillness of a man managing a situation, but the frozen stillness of a man who has just stepped onto ice and is not yet sure whether it will hold. Hartwell was already opening his copy of the meeting documents. Diane Cross had her laptop open. The older man whom Claire had introduced without ceremony as Marcus Webb Senior Advisor to the Bennett Legacy Trust was looking at Daniel with the patient, unreadable expression of someone who has seen every version of this moment before and finds none of them surprising. Greg Halston had not looked up from the table. Daniel looked at Claire. She was looking at her documents. Her pen was in her hand. Her posture was the posture of a woman who was exactly where she intended to be, doing exactly what she intended to do, and who had not a single molecule of uncertainty about either of those things. "Daniel," she said without looking up, "you can close your mouth. We have a lot to cover." Someone on the Nexum side made a sound that was not quite a cough and not quite a laugh and was very quickly suppressed. Daniel closed his mouth. He straightened in his chair. He reached for the version of himself that he had been building for 15 years, the composed, confident, in-command version, and he found it barely and pulled it on like a coat that no longer quite fit. "Of course," he said. "Let's proceed." But his voice was half a note off and everyone in the room could hear it. Hartwell began with the standard, opening the structure of the meeting, the agenda items, the sequence in which documents would be reviewed. Daniel had heard versions of this opening in a dozen meetings. Normally it was background noise, the formal prologue before the real conversation started. Today he listened to every word because listening gave him something to do with his face, while his mind was doing something else entirely. His mind was doing a rapid and increasingly desperate inventory. How long had she known about Nexum? How long had she known about the trust's connection to the investment group? Had she known when she signed the divorce papers, when she sat across from him in his office with that clear, settled expression and said, "You're going to want to remember this moment"? Had she already known that she was walking into a position where she would be sitting across from him like this, holding cards he hadn't known existed? I thought about the thin folder Greg had shown him Tuesday morning, the ownership chain that disappeared into opacity, the private trust structure that their due diligence people couldn't find the end of. He had said, mystery ownership is practically a status symbol at this level. He pressed one hand flat against his thigh under the table. She had known. She had known all of it. She had looked at him across his desk and signed those papers and walked out, and she had known exactly where they were both going to end up, and she had said nothing. Not nothing, she had said one thing. "You're going to want to remember this moment." He remembered it now. Hartwell had moved into the first agenda item, the performance review of Whitmore Capital Solutions' last 3 fiscal years, standard due diligence material. Daniel had reviewed these documents so many times he could have recited the key figures in his sleep. Then Diane Cross slid a different set of documents across the table. "Before we proceed with the standard review," she said, "we'd like to address some questions that came up during our additional due diligence process." Her voice was professional and even. She said additional due diligence the way a doctor might say, "We'd like to run a few more tests with a neutral precision that carried all of its weight in what it didn't say." Specifically, some discrepancies between the projected figures provided to us in the preliminary discussions and the actual internal performance data. Daniel felt Greg shift in his seat beside him. Just slightly. Just enough. "Discrepancies," Daniel said. The word came out steadier than he felt. "Yes." Diane Cross opened to a specific page and turned it so Daniel could see it. 2 columns of numbers side by side. The left column was what he had presented to them. The right column was something else, something that had come from somewhere he had not anticipated. He looked at the numbers. He looked at them for a long time. "Where did this data come from?" he said. "From your own internal systems," Claire said. She said it simply factually, without inflection. Not like she was accusing him of anything, like she was reading from a document. "The Trust's financial team has had access to your internal reporting architecture for the past several months through an arrangement with one of your subsidiary providers. The data is yours, Daniel. We just compiled it differently than you presented it." The silence that dropped into the room after that was extraordinary. Daniel looked at her. "That's not possible." "It's very possible," she said, and now she did look up, and her eyes met his, and they were steady and clear and completely without malice. "It happened. The numbers in the right column are accurate. The numbers in the left column represent a projection variance of between 31 and 44% above actual performance depending on the quarter. That variance was not disclosed to any of the institutional investors currently holding positions in your company." Daniel's right hand, flat against his thigh, curled slowly into a fist. Across the table, Marcus Webb had opened a separate folder and was distributing additional documents to each person at the Nexum side of the table with the unhurried efficiency of a man who has been planning this distribution for days. Greg Halston finally looked up. His face was the color of paper. "I'd like a moment," Greg said. His voice cracked slightly on the second word. "To consult with my—" "Of course," Hartwell said. "No," Daniel said. Everyone looked at him. Daniel looked at Greg and then looked away. He looked at the numbers in the right column. He thought about the pension fund. He thought about 8 months ago. He thought about the conversation he and Greg had in his office on Tuesday, when Greg had stood at the door with his hand on the knob and said, "Was it?" And Daniel had said, "Close the door on your way out." He had chosen to close the door. He had chosen that exact moment to stop the conversation and close the door and not look at what was on the other side. And now the door was open, all the way open, and everyone in this room was looking through it. "I need to understand," Daniel said, and his voice was careful and measured and almost convincing, "what exactly you're suggesting." Claire closed her folio. She folded her hands on top of it. She looked at him with the full, undivided attention of someone who has been waiting for this moment with great patience and is now prepared to give it everything it deserves. "I'm not suggesting anything," she said. "I'm not suggesting anything," she said. "I'm presenting documented evidence of a material discrepancy between the information provided to investors and the actual performance of your company. What I'm suggesting, and this is a suggestion, not an accusation because I want to be clear about the difference, is that this meeting pause while the appropriate documentation is reviewed, the affected parties are notified, and a path forward is identified that prioritizes the protection of the people most at risk." "The people most at risk," Daniel repeated. Something in his voice had changed. The composure was thinning the way ice thins when it can no longer hold the weight above it. "You mean the investors?" "I mean the employees," she said. "The 400 people on your payroll who have retirement savings tied to a valuation that doesn't reflect reality." And there it was, the thing that landed differently than everything else. Not the numbers, not the fraud implications, not the professional devastation of being exposed in front of the people whose money he needed most. The word employees, the word retirement, the word people. Daniel looked at her, and for the first time since she walked through the door, he could not maintain the distance he was trying to maintain, could not keep the wall between the person across from him and the person he had dismissed and mocked and waved away like a fly he had already forgotten. He looked at his wife, his ex-wife, the woman he had handed a pen to and told to sign and thanked for not making it difficult. He said very quietly, "You knew about this before the divorce." It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "And you still—" He stopped. The sentence didn't have a good ending. "I signed the papers," she said. "Yes, because those were two separate things, Daniel. What you did to our marriage and what you did to those people. Both of them are real. Both of them have consequences, but they're not the same thing, and they don't get resolved the same way." The room was so quiet that the faint sound of traffic 14 floors below was audible. Hartwell looked at Marcus Webb. Marcus Webb was looking at Claire. Diane Cross was looking at her laptop with the focused attention of a woman who understands that she is witnessing something that goes beyond business and is being professionally discreet about the fact. Greg Halston put both hands flat on the table and said in a voice that was barely recognizable as his own, "I want to cooperate fully. Whatever the trust needs, whatever documentation, I want to cooperate." Daniel turned and looked at him. Greg did not look back. His eyes were on Claire. "I want you to know," Greg said, and his voice was doing something it almost never did. It was completely unmanaged, completely honest, stripped of every layer of practiced confidence. "I want you to know that I understood what we were doing was wrong. I understood it for a long time, and He stopped. He pressed his hands harder against the table. "I should have stopped it earlier." The confession landed in the room like something physical. Daniel looked at Greg. He looked at him for a long time, and then he did something no one in that room expected. He laughed. Not the full contemptuous laugh from his office 4 days ago. Something shorter and hollower and entirely without humor. The laugh of a man who has just understood something about himself that he cannot undo. "You're going to cooperate," Daniel said to Greg. "Of course you are." He looked back at Claire. She was watching him with the same steadiness she had held throughout the entire meeting, not triumphant, not satisfied, not angry, just present, just clear. "What happens now?" he said. "That depends on you," she said. "The pension protection for the employees is already in place. That's done, regardless of what happens in this room. The institutional investors who were given inaccurate projections will be made whole through a trust-backed remediation process. That's also done." She paused. "What happens to you and to Whitmore Capital Solutions depends on what you choose to do in the next 48 hours. What does that mean? It means that there is a difference between someone who made choices and ran from them and someone who made choices and faced them. She looked at him steadily. "You have an opportunity to be the second person. It won't undo what was done, but it matters. It matters to the people affected, and it matters in every other way that counts." Daniel sat with that for a long moment. The room waited. He thought about the suit, the charcoal gray Armani he had chosen because he wanted to feel like a man who had already won. He thought about the version of himself he had been building the skyline, confirmation, the powerful friends, the life that was finally aligning exactly the way he always intended. He thought about the moment he had stopped being grateful and started being entitled. He couldn't find it. It hadn't been one moment. It had been a slow erosion, a series of small choices that each seemed reasonable in isolation, and that added up over time to a person he wouldn't have recognized at 25. He thought about the woman across the table, the woman he had married because she was steady and kind and believed in him before he believed in himself, the woman he had looked at one morning and decided was furniture he had already decided to replace. The woman who had known for years that she could have ended him with a phone call and had chosen instead to sit quietly at his kitchen table and make 2 cups of coffee out of habit. He pressed both hands flat on the table. He looked at Hartwell. He looked at Diane Cross. He looked at Marcus Webb. Then he looked at Claire. "Tell me what you need from me," he said. And something in Claire's face shifted, something very small, very briefly in the area around her eyes. Not satisfaction, not victory. Something quieter than both of those things, something that looked almost like relief. "Full disclosure," she said. "Everything, every document, every communication, every decision point, to the Trust's legal team, to the affected investors, and to the regulatory bodies that will need to be notified." She paused. "Starting today." "Today," he repeated. "Today," she confirmed. "There's a team waiting." He looked at Greg. Greg was already reaching for his phone with shaking hands. Daniel watched him for a moment and then looked away. "All right," Daniel said. He said it quietly, without performance, without the voice he used in important rooms. Just all right. 2 words from a man who has run out of larger ones. Hartwell nodded slowly and made a note. Diane Cross began typing. Marcus Webb closed his folder with the practiced efficiency of a man who has just watched something resolve the way he hoped it would. The meeting continued for another 3 hours. Daniel talked. He answered questions. He provided access codes and document locations and explained in precise detail the decisions that had been made and when and by whom. His voice stayed level throughout. He did not deflect. He did not qualify. He did not perform contrition in the performative way that people sometimes do when they know they're being watched, the way that's more about managing the audience than actually taking responsibility. He just talked. Straight, clean. It was the most honest he had been in years. Claire listened to all of it. She asked questions when she needed to. She did not look at him with contempt. She did not look at him with anything really except the careful attention of a person making sure the information was complete and accurate. At one point around the 2nd hour, Daniel said something, a clarification about a specific decision point, 8 months ago, and Claire wrote something down in her folio, and the pen moving across the page made a small sound in the quiet room, and for some reason that sound hit Daniel harder than anything else that had happened in those 3 hours. The quiet, unremarkable sound of his wife writing down the truth about what he had done. He had to stop talking for a moment. He looked at the table. He breathed. "Take your time," Claire said, and her voice was exactly what it had always been, calm and even and without cruelty. The voice of a woman who is not enjoying this, who never wanted this, who would have given a great deal for any version of these 7 years that had ended differently. He knew that. In that moment he knew it completely. He took his time. Then he kept talking. When it was over, when the last document had been identified and the last question had been answered, and Hartwell was summarizing the next steps for all parties, Daniel sat in his chair and felt empty in a way that was not entirely unpleasant, like a room that has been cleared out after holding too much furniture for too long. Greg had left the room 20 minutes before the end. Someone from the Trust's legal team had met him in the hallway. Daniel had watched him go and had not said anything. Hartwell and Diane Cross gathered their materials with the brisk professionalism of people who deal in situations like this regularly and have learned to move through the emotional weather of them without being derailed. Marcus Webb had a brief, quiet conversation with Claire that Daniel couldn't hear, and then he shook hands with Hartwell and left. And then it was just Daniel and Claire in the room. He had not planned for this moment. He had not prepared anything to say. He sat across from her and looked at her and tried to find words that were adequate to the distance between them and could not. She was gathering her folio. She was unhurried. She moved the way she had always moved, with a quiet efficiency that he had once found unremarkable and now understood was the movement of a person who has never needed to perform anything for anyone. "Claire," he said. She looked up. "I don't know what I'm supposed to say." She looked at him for a moment. "You're not supposed to say anything particular," she said. "There's no script for this." He stopped, started again. I knew somewhere. I think I knew for a long time that what I was building wasn't, that the way I was doing things wasn't. Another stop. I kept telling myself it was necessary, that the end result would justify it, that once I got to the point I was aiming for, I could start doing things the right way. That's what people tell themselves, she said, not unkindly, just factually. I know. He looked at his hands. Did you ever when we were... He couldn't finish that either. She saved him the effort. There were years, she said quietly, when you were exactly who I hoped you were. I want you to know that. It wasn't all wrong. The beginning wasn't wrong. Then what happened? She tilted her head slightly. You started believing that what you were building was more important than how you were building it. And then you started believing that the people who couldn't help you build it were in your way. She picked up her folio. I was in your way, so you moved me. I had nothing to say to that, because it was true, and he knew it was true, and knowing it and sitting with it fully, without the insulation of self-justification that was different than anything he had felt in years. What happens to the company, he said. The trust will restructure the debt and recapitalize. There will be significant governance changes, a new board structure with external oversight. The employees keep their jobs. She paused. All of them. He absorbed that. And me? That's not up to me, she said. The regulatory process will determine what accountability looks like. I've provided the legal team with a recommendation that focuses on restitution over prosecution, but I can't control what they decide. You recommended leniency. I recommended proportionality, she corrected. There's a difference. She moved toward the door and then paused with her hand on the frame, not looking at him, just pausing. Daniel. Yeah. The man you were in the beginning, the one who came home tired and grateful and held on to things because he was still figuring out how to stand up on his own. She paused. He was worth something. He's still in there somewhere. I'd start looking for him. She walked out. He sat in the empty room for a long time after that. Long enough that someone knocked and asked if he needed anything, and he said no, and they went away, and the room went quiet again. I thought about what she had said, not about the company or the legal process or the restructuring, the other thing, the personal thing. He thought about the man who had come home tired and grateful and held on. He thought about the morning he had put on his best suit to end his marriage. I thought about how far those two men were from each other, and how if he was very honest with himself, he could trace the distance exactly, could identify every choice, every rationalization, every small surrender of something real in exchange for something impressive. He could see the whole map of it now laid out behind him, and it was not a map he was proud of. But he was 39 years old, and the map of what was behind him was not the same thing as the map of what was ahead. He picked up his phone. He looked at it for a long time. Then he dialed his own office and asked April, the receptionist who had always been kind to Claire in a careful, guilty sort of way, to please cancel his afternoon and hold all his calls. Of course, Mr. Whitmore, she said. Is everything okay? He thought about it honestly, which was something he had not done in a long time. No, he said, but I think it's going to get there. He hung up. He sat in the empty room. He thought about 412 people who had gone to work that morning, not knowing that the ground had been made solid under their feet by a woman they had never met, who did not know them, who had never needed to do anything for any of them, and had done it anyway because she understood something that he had lost along the way, that power is not for proving. Power is for protecting. He sat with that for a long time. The city moved below the window. The afternoon light moved across the floor. Daniel Whitmore sat in a room where everything had fallen apart and understood for the first time in years that falling apart and being destroyed were not the same thing, and that the difference between them was entirely a matter of what a person chose to do next. He had some choices to make. He was ready to start making them correctly. The news broke on a Friday. Not because anyone planned it that way. These things rarely break on a schedule. They break when the pressure behind them becomes greater than the structure containing them. And by Friday morning, 3 days after the Nexum meeting, the pressure had been building quietly and steadily in ways that Daniel had set in motion himself, through the disclosures he had made, through the documents he had authorized, through the phone calls he had placed to people he owed honesty to, and had been avoiding for longer than he wanted to admit. The story appeared first in the financial press. A brief item carefully worded about a major restructuring at Whitmore Capital Solutions, involving a significant trust-backed recapitalization and new governance arrangements. By afternoon, it had grown. By evening, it had details that Daniel had not expected to be public yet. Names, figures, the pension exposure, the projection variance. By the time he went to bed Friday night, his phone had received 214 messages, and he had answered 11 of them. He lay in the dark of his downtown apartment and listened to the city and did not sleep for a very long time. He had expected this. He had known walking out of that meeting room Thursday afternoon that the days following would be the hardest of his professional life. He had known it intellectually the way a person knows that a surgery will be painful before they go under, understanding it abstractly, but not yet having felt it in the body. Now it was in the body. Now it was the specific weight of 203 unanswered messages, and the specific sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand, and the specific quality of silence that exists in an apartment where a person is entirely alone with what they've done. He picked up the phone at 2 a.m, not to answer messages. He opened his contacts and scrolled to a name and looked at it for a long time, and then put the phone down without calling. He was not ready for that conversation yet. He wasn't sure he would ever be ready. But he knew it had to happen, and knowing it had to happen was at 2 a.m. in the dark, almost worse than anything else. By Saturday, the story had grown legs. Sandra Torres saw it on her phone while she was making breakfast for her kids. She read the headline twice. Then she put the phone face down on the counter and stood very still for a moment, and her daughter, 16, perceptive in this specific way teenage daughters are perceptive, which is to say, almost supernaturally looked at her from across the kitchen and said, "Mom, you okay?" "Yeah," Sandra said. She picked up the phone again. She read the part about the pension protection, the trust-backed guarantee that had been filed and registered before the meeting. She read it twice the same way she had read the headline. Then she sat down at the kitchen table without finishing making breakfast and pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed. Her son wandered in from the hallway and looked at her and then at his sister. "What's wrong with Mom?" "Nothing," her daughter said, watching Sandra carefully. "I think something good happened." Sandra looked up. Her eyes were wet, which surprised her because she was not a person who cried easily. "Something good," she repeated, and then she laughed, a short surprised sound like something that had been held in too long. Yeah, something good happened." She thought about the woman who had rung her buzzer, the woman in the simple coat with the clean handwriting who had sat at her kitchen table and drunk her coffee and said with complete simplicity, "I give a damn." Sandra had believed her in the moment, not because she had any particular reason to, but because she had spent 47 years learning to read people, and something about that woman had been entirely uncomplicatedly true. She was right to believe her. She picked up her phone and opened her email and sent a message to an address she had written down on a piece of paper and kept in the kitchen drawer. She didn't know if it would reach anyone. She sent it anyway. It said, "Thank you. I don't know who you really are, but thank you." She put the phone down and finished making breakfast. 20 minutes later, her phone buzzed with a reply. 4 words. It said, "You deserved better. Always. No signature." Sandra Torres put the phone on the counter and looked at it for a moment. Then she called her kids to eat. Claire was in a different part of the city when that message arrived. She was in a building that she had used for trust business for years, the architectural firm Exterior, the quiet elevator sitting across from Priya Sato, and 2 regulatory compliance specialists who had been brought in to manage the disclosure process with the relevant financial authorities. She had been there since 7 a.m. The regulatory conversation was the one she had been most prepared for, and also the one she had found most difficult to sit through, because regulatory process has its own momentum once it begins, and that momentum does not particularly care about the human textures of the situation, about Daniel in the empty meeting room, about Greg Halston's shaking hands, about 412 people who had simply gone to work. It cares about categories and precedents and compliance frameworks, and Claire understood all of those things, but she found herself needing periodically to remind herself why those frameworks existed in the first place. They existed because of Sandra Torres. They existed because of every Sandra Torres who had ever trusted an institution that didn't deserve the trust. The SEC inquiry is going to be broad, the senior compliance specialist, a methodical man named Arthur Gill, who had spent 20 years on both sides of these conversations, was saying. Given the scale of the projection variance and the number of affected investors, they'll want full cooperation documentation from all parties. Whitmore's voluntary disclosure is helpful. It's materially helpful. But I want you to understand that voluntary disclosure doesn't close this. It opens a more cooperative version of it. I understand, Claire said. The determination of whether what occurred rises to the level of securities fraud versus aggressive misrepresentation versus... Arthur, she said quietly. He stopped. I know the categories, she said. I've read the relevant statutes. What I need from you right now is a clear assessment of the timeline and what our role is in each phase. Arthur Gill looked at her over his glasses with the expression of a man recalibrating. He had been told before this meeting that he would be advising a trust representative on a sensitive corporate matter. He had not been told he would be advising someone who had clearly already read the relevant statutes. 4 to 6 weeks for the preliminary inquiry, he said, adjusting. The trust's cooperation designation will be formally recognized within 10 days, which limits your exposure significantly. Whitmore's cooperation will be evaluated independently. And the employees, the pension remediation. That's already outside the regulatory process. The guarantee structure you filed Wednesday night is airtight. I reviewed it myself this morning. He paused. Frankly, whoever drafted that moved fast and drafted well. Priya drafted it, Claire said. Priya across the table did not look up from her notes, but the corners of her mouth moved slightly. Then Priya did excellent work, Arthur said. The meeting continued for another 2 hours. When it was over, Claire walked out of the building and stood on the sidewalk and took a long breath of Chicago air, which was cold and carried the first edge of the coming winter, and she felt the exhaustion of the past week settle into her shoulders and her back, and the specific place behind her eyes where stress accumulates when it's been managed rather than felt. She had been managing it. She had been moving through each piece of this with the focused efficiency that Marcus had once described approvingly as your mother's particular gift. Her mother had been able to hold an enormous amount of complexity and continue operating through it without letting the complexity become emotion until the moment was right to let it be emotion. Claire had inherited that, but she was aware standing on the sidewalk in the cold that the moment was coming closer. The moment when the complexity would need to become something simpler and more personal. The moment when she would need to stop managing and start feeling. She wasn't there yet. There was still too much to do, but she could feel it coming. Her phone rang. It was a number she recognized but hadn't expected to see. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at it for 2 full rings before she answered. April, she said. Daniel's receptionist, the young woman who had always been kind to Claire in a careful, guilty way, was quiet for a moment on the other end, as if she hadn't quite expected Claire to pick up. Mrs. Whitmore, April said, and then caught herself. I'm sorry, Ms. Bennett. I needed to call you. It's all right, April. What is it? I just wanted you to know. April's voice was doing something complicated, the vocal quality of someone trying to be professional about something that is not professional at all. I saw the news about the pension protection, about what the trust did for the employees before the meeting. A pause. Some of us have been talking today, a lot of us, and I just on behalf of I don't know how to say this properly. You don't have to say it properly, Claire said. Thank you, April said. From all of us. Thank you. Claire pressed her free hand flat against the front of her coat, over the same spot she had pressed it in the elevator the day she left Daniel's office for the last time. You all deserve better than you got, she said. I'm sorry it took this long for someone to make it right. Can I ask you something? Yes. Did you know, April said, before the divorce, did you know what was happening with the pension? Claire was quiet for a moment. I knew something was wrong, she said. I didn't know exactly what until after. But you protected us before the meeting, before it was public, before anyone knew. Yes. Another pause. Why? Claire thought about Sandra Torres's kitchen table. She thought about the school papers at one end of it, and the dish towel over Sandra's shoulder, and the tired eyes that sharpened when they heard the word safe. She thought about what it means to be a person who has gone to work and done the right things, and trusted the institution around you, and been failed by the people at the top of it. Because someone should have, she said simply. April made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite not. Okay, she said. Okay. After she hung up, Claire stood on the sidewalk for another moment. Then she started walking. She didn't have a destination. She just walked the way she sometimes needed to when her mind was processing more than it could sit still with. She walked for 20 minutes. Then her phone rang again. This time the number made her stop walking entirely. It was Daniel. She stood on the sidewalk with the phone in her hand and the city moving around her, and she looked at his name on the screen and understood with complete clarity that this was the call she had been expecting, and the call she had been in no particular hurry to have, and the call that was nonetheless necessary. She answered on the fourth ring. "Daniel." "Hi." His voice was quieter than she had ever heard it. Not the controlled quiet of a man managing a room, the genuine quiet of a man who is very tired. "I wasn't sure you'd pick up." "I almost didn't." "I know." A pause. "I've been trying to figure out what to say for 3 days." "You don't have to have it figured out," she said. "Say what's true." A long pause. She could hear him breathing. "I'm sorry," he said. Not the word delivered as performance or transaction, just the word, bear. "I know that doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't change what happened or what I did or how I treated you. I just needed to say it in a way that wasn't in a way that was just between us. Not in a meeting room, not in front of lawyers." She kept walking, slower now. "I hear you," she said. "I've been thinking about what you said when you left the room Thursday." Another pause. "About the man from the beginning, the one who held on." "I remember what I said. I've been trying to find him, like you suggested." His voice had something in it she hadn't heard in a long time, something uncertain and real and reaching. "It's harder than I thought, not because he's not there, but because I have to look at everything that happened between him and now and actually look at it, not explain it, just look at it." "That's the harder version," she said. "That's also the only version that works." "Yeah." He went quiet again. "Claire, can I ask you something?" "You can ask." "Did you ever—" He stopped. The sentence was difficult, and she could hear him trying to find the shape of it. "Was there a point where it could have gone differently, where if I had done things differently, is there a version of this where we didn't end up here?" She stopped walking. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at the street and thought about the question honestly, which it deserved. "For a long time," she said carefully. "Yes, there was a version of you that I believed in completely, a version that was worth building a life with. And I stayed in this marriage past the point I should have because I kept thinking that version was still available, that I could reach it somehow." "When did you stop thinking that—" "When I found the emails," she said. 3 weeks before you handed me the pen." The silence on the other end was the silence of a man who has just had a specific piece of information land in a new context and is understanding something he hadn't understood before. "You knew," he said. "For 3 weeks before the divorce you knew about you knew." "Yes." "And you didn't say anything?" "No." "Why?" She thought about it. "Because I needed to know what you would choose, without me forcing the choice, without confrontation or ultimatum. I needed to know if you would choose to be honest with me on your own." A pause. "You didn't. You chose the divorce instead, which answered the question." He was quiet for a very long time. "I was a coward." "You were afraid," she said. "There's a difference even if the outcome is the same." "Does the difference matter?" "Understanding it does," she said. "For whatever you build next." He absorbed that. She could feel him sitting with it the way she had learned to feel when he was actually processing something versus when he was just waiting for a pause to respond. "The company," he said. "The restructuring, the new board. I've been told I can stay on in an advisory capacity during the transition if I cooperate fully with everything, which I intend to." A pause. "Was that your decision, the advisory capacity option?" "It was my recommendation," she said. "The board will decide." "Why did you recommend it?" "Because you know that company better than anyone else. Because the employees need stability during the transition. And because burning everything down doesn't serve the people I'm trying to protect." She paused. "It also doesn't serve you. And despite everything, I don't want to see you destroyed, Daniel. I want to see you changed." He made a sound, not a word, just a sound, the kind that happens when emotion arrives before language can organize it. "I don't deserve that," he said finally. "Probably not," she said. "But it's what you're getting anyway, because I'm choosing it. Not for you, for myself. Because I decided a long time ago that I wasn't going to let what happened between us make me into a smaller person than I was before it." She started walking again. The cold air moved around her. The city did what cities do, continuous, indifferent, enormous. "Okay," Daniel said. "Okay," she agreed. "Is there anything you need from me for the regulatory process? Anything beyond what I've already—" "Marcus will be in touch with specifics," she said. "But Daniel," She paused. The thing that will matter most in that process is consistency. Don't be a different person on Tuesday than you were on Thursday. That's the thing that will determine how this resolves. I know. Good. Another pause. Longer. The kind of pause that happens at the end of something. Claire, he said. Yeah. I hope... He stopped. Started again. I hope the next version of your life is everything the life we had together wasn't. She held the phone against her ear and let that land. Let herself feel it completely without management. It hurt in the specific way that true things sometimes hurt, not because they're cruel, but because they're real, and because real things have edges. Me too, she said. She hung up. She walked for another block, and then she stopped and sat down on a bench and put her hands in her lap and let herself for the first time in 8 days feel everything she had been managing. She did not cry for long. She was not by nature a long cry person. But she cried fully and honestly for about 4 minutes, with the cold air moving around her, and the city doing its continuous, indifferent, enormous thing, and nobody paid particular attention, because this is Chicago, and people have things happening to them all the time, and the city has long since learned to hold space for it without comment. When she was done, she sat up straight. She took a breath. She pressed her hands flat on her thighs. She thought about what came next. Not Daniel. Not the regulatory process, not the restructuring, not the legal complexity that would occupy the next several months. Those things were real and would require her attention, but they were not what she was thinking about in that moment. She was thinking about the trust, about what 4 generations of her family had built and what she intended to build with it going forward. About the fact that she had spent 7 years making herself invisible, and had spent the past 8 days making herself visible, and had discovered in the process that the visible version of herself was significantly more useful to the world than the invisible one had been. She thought about Sandra Torres. She thought about April's voice on the phone. She thought about the 412 people at Whitmore Capital Solutions who had gone to work on Friday morning, not knowing that a week of decisions made on their behalf had determined whether the ground under their feet was solid or hollow. She thought about all the other companies, all the other Sandra Torres, all the other 412. She had an instrument in her hands, an instrument of extraordinary reach and power that had been used in her family's history with varying degrees of wisdom and care. Her great-grandfather had been shrewd. Her grandfather had been expansive. Her mother had been protective. Each generation had added something. What was she going to add? She already knew the answer. She had known it, she realized, from the moment she sat at that table in Geneva at 25 and signed her name and became the person responsible for something larger than herself. She had just needed to live enough of her life to understand what it looked like in practice. It looked like a guarantee structure filed at 9 o'clock at night, so that people who had nothing to do with the decisions of powerful men would not pay for those decisions with their futures. It looked like sitting at a kitchen table in a working-class neighborhood and drinking coffee with a woman who needed someone to look her in the eye and say, "I give a damn." It looked like choosing when you had the power to destroy, to protect instead. She stood up from the bench. She straightened her coat. She picked up her phone and called Marcus. "I need to schedule a meeting," she said when he answered. "Not about the Whitmore matter, something new." "Of course," he said. "When Monday," she said. "I want the full trust leadership, financial, legal, community investment. Everyone." A brief pause. "May I ask the subject?" "I want to talk about what we do with what we have," she said. "Not defensively, not just protecting existing structures. I want to talk about building something." She was already walking. Her pace had changed, not the careful, managed pace of someone moving through a situation, but the purposeful stride of someone moving toward something. "I want to talk about what the Bennett Legacy Trust becomes in the next 20 years, what we invest in, who we invest in, what it means to have this kind of resource and use it intentionally." "That's a significant conversation," Marcus said. "I know. That's why I want everyone there." Another pause. The kind of pause Marcus used when he was pleased but was being professional about it. "I'll send the invitations tonight." "Thank you." She paused at a crosswalk waiting for the light. "And Marcus?" "Yes. Find me everything we have on community development investment in the Midwest. Housing, education, small business infrastructure. I want to understand what the gaps are and where capital would actually move the needle. I can have preliminary research to you by Sunday evening." "Good." The light changed. She crossed. "One more thing. Miss Bennett, The woman Sandra Torres, the employee who wrote the email, I want to find a way to offer her a position, something commensurate with her actual abilities, not her current title. Have someone talk to her carefully, not pressingly, and find out what she would actually want if the limitation of what was available wasn't a factor. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You want to recruit her? I want to give her options she doesn't currently have, Claire said. Whether she takes them is up to her, but I want her to have them. Understood. She hung up. She put the phone in her pocket. She kept walking. The city moved around her. It was the same city. It had always been the same streets, the same noise, the same enormous, indifferent, continuous life of a place where millions of people are each inside their own story, each carrying something, each moving toward or away from something that matters to them in ways the city will never know and doesn't need to. But she was not the same person she had been 8 days ago, or rather, she was exactly the same person finally. The person she had been folding away and hiding and managing down for 7 years was the same person walking these streets right now, and the freedom of that was so large and so simple that she kept encountering the edges of it with a kind of surprise. The way you keep noticing a weight is gone after you've been carrying it for so long, you forgot it was there. She was not performing ordinary anymore. She was just herself, fully, without apology or concealment or the careful management of other people's perceptions. It felt, she thought, like the first real breath after a very long time of breathing shallowly. She turned a corner. She walked another block. She stopped in front of a coffee shop she had been to 100 times during her 7 years in this city, the same one she and Daniel had gone to on Sunday mornings in the early years, when his company was still small and uncertain, and he would talk about his plans with his hands moving and his voice alive with something that had not yet calcified into arrogance. She went in. She ordered a coffee. She sat at a table by the window and wrapped both hands around the cup and let the warmth move into her palms. She thought about Monday's meeting. She thought about the research Marcus would have for her by Sunday. She thought about what it meant to take something that had been built over 4 generations, primarily as a structure of preservation, and ask it to become something more actively useful. The thinking that would take, the relationships that would need to be built, the failures that would happen because anything worth doing fails sometimes, and what matters is not the failure, but what you build on the other side of it. She was not afraid of any of it. That was the thing she kept coming back to, for the first time in years, maybe for the first time in her adult life, because even before Daniel, there had been the weight of the inheritance, the enormity of what she had been handed at 25. She was not afraid. She was ready. She sipped her coffee. She looked out the window at the city. She thought about her mother, who had sat in a room in Geneva and watched her daughter sign her name and had not said, "Be careful," had not said, "This is a burden," had looked at her daughter across that table and said with the quiet certainty of a woman who knew her child, "You'll know what to do with it when the time comes." The time had come. She knew what to do. She sat in the coffee shop until her cup was empty, and then she sat for a little longer just because she could, just because she was allowed to, just because she was a woman who had stopped hiding and had found on the other side of the hiding, not the chaos she might have feared, but something much simpler and much better than that. She had found herself, and she intended to make excellent use of what she found. The Monday meeting started at 8 in the morning and did not end until nearly 2 in the afternoon. Claire had expected it to run long. She had not expected it to become what it became, which was not a strategy session or a portfolio review or the kind of careful managed corporate conversation that trust leadership meetings usually were. It became something else. It became the kind of meeting where people who have spent years being professionally cautious start saying what they actually think, because the person at the head of the table has made it clear without saying so directly that cautious and careful are no longer the primary values in the room. There were 11 people around the table: Marcus, Priya, Richard Holt, 4 members of the Trust's financial leadership, 2 community investment specialists who had been with the organization for years and had, in Claire's assessment after reviewing their work over the weekend, been significantly underutilized. A communications director named James Okafor, who had joined the Trust 2 years ago and who had in every meeting Claire had attended before this one, said very little. James Okafor said a great deal on Monday. "The issue," he said about 40 minutes into the meeting, with the energy of a man who has been waiting for permission to say something for a long time, "is that the Trust has been operating as if invisibility is a virtue, and I understand why. I understand the historical reasons. But invisibility at this scale doesn't actually protect anything. It just means that the power you have doesn't have a face, and power without a face tends to get interpreted by the people it affects as either random or malicious. Neither of those is what we want. The room was quiet. People who had been nodding carefully were now nodding less carefully. "What are you suggesting?" Marcus said, not challengingly, with genuine interest. "I'm suggesting that what Ms. Bennett did last week, protecting those employees showing up in that room being visible, did more to establish what this trust actually stands for than 20 years of anonymous philanthropy." James looked at Claire directly. "I think we should stop being anonymous. Not entirely, not recklessly, but strategically, purposefully. I think we should let people know that this resource exists and that it can be on their side." Claire looked at him for a moment. "What does that look like in practice?" James leaned forward. "It looks like a public-facing initiative, a named fund, something that carries the Bennett name, since that name is now going to be in the news, regardless, specifically focused on employee protection and community investment in underserved markets. It looks like being the entity that companies and employees can point to and say, there is someone paying attention, there is accountability." He paused. "It looks like you, Ms. Bennett, being willing to be the face of that." The room waited. Claire had thought about this. She had thought about it sitting in the coffee shop Saturday afternoon and again Sunday morning while she was reading through Marcus's research. She had thought about what it meant to step fully into visibility after years of deliberate concealment. She had turned it over from every angle, looking for the version of it that felt like performance or ego, trying to be honest with herself about whether the impulse was genuine or something smaller. She kept arriving at the same place. "I'm willing," she said. And something shifted in the room. Not dramatically, not with applause or exclamation, just a collective exhale, the sound of 11 people who have been holding something back releasing it at the same time. Marcus at his end of the table allowed himself a full smile. It was the first time Claire had seen him smile fully in years. "Then let's talk about what we build," he said. They talked for another 4 hours. By the time the meeting ended, they had the architecture of something real. A named initiative, the Bennett Foundation for Working Families, distinct from the trust itself, but backed by it, focused on 3 areas: employee protection and pension security, small business infrastructure in underserved communities, and educational access for first-generation college students. A communication strategy that would introduce Claire publicly, not as a celebrity or a spectacle, but as a person with a specific purpose and the resources to pursue it. A timeline, a team, a set of first investments that were ready to move within 30 days. It was not a plan that had been built to impress anyone. It was a plan that had been built to work. When the last person filed out of the conference room, Claire sat alone at the table for a few minutes. She looked at the documents spread in front of her. She thought about her mother in Geneva signing papers. She thought about her great-grandfather and the land under the railroad tracks. She thought about 4 generations of people who had built something larger than themselves and had managed imperfectly but genuinely to pass it forward. She thought, "I am ready to add my part." She gathered the documents. She stood. She walked out. The week that followed moved fast, faster than she expected, and she had expected it to move fast. The public announcement of the Bennett Foundation for Working Families went out on Wednesday morning, accompanied by a statement from Claire that James Okafor had helped her write, and that she had revised 4 times until it sounded like her actual voice, and not the polished approximation of her actual voice. The statement was not long. It said in plain language what had happened, and what she intended to do about it, and why. It said, "I spent years hiding what I had because I wanted to be known for who I was. I understand now that what I have and who I am are not separate things. They are the same instrument, and I intend to use it." The response was immediate and large, and came from directions she had not entirely anticipated. The financial press covered it with the particular mixture of respect and calculation that the financial press applies to everything, analyzing the trust's reach, speculating about the implications for corporate governance, interviewing experts about what a foundation of this scale could mean for employee protection standards nationally. That coverage she had expected. What she hadn't fully anticipated was everything else. The personal messages, the emails to the Foundation's newly established contact address, thousands of them, from employees at other companies, from small business owners, from people who had been through versions of what the Whitmore Capital employees had been through and had found no one paying attention. from people who had been dismissed and underestimated and moved aside, and who read about a woman who had experienced the same thing and had responded not with bitterness, but with construction. She did not read every message. She could not. But she read enough. She read enough to understand that what she had done was not just a personal resolution. It had touched something that a great many people had been waiting without knowing they were waiting to see touched. Sandra Torres called her directly on Thursday. "My daughter showed me the news," Sandra said. Her voice had a different quality than it had at the kitchen table, less tired, more alive. "The foundation." She read me the statement out loud. A pause. She cried. "How old is your daughter?" Claire asked. 16. She wants to be a lawyer. Specifically, she wants to be the kind of lawyer who does what you did. Sandra made a sound that was half laugh, half something more serious. "I told her there aren't enough of those." "There will be," Claire said. "That's part of what we're building." A pause. "That job offer your people mentioned," Sandra said. "I've been thinking about it." Claire waited. "I've spent 20 years being good at things that other people got credit for," Sandra said. "I know how to run operations. I know how to see where systems are broken and figure out how to fix them. I've been doing that at Whitmore Capital for 4 years, and every time I did it, someone above me took the report and put their name on it, and I went back to answering emails." Her voice was steady and direct, and completely without self-pity, the voice of a woman stating facts. "I don't want to do that anymore." "You won't?" Claire said. "Not here. The title we're offering is Director of Operational Integrity for the Foundation. It means exactly what it says. You would be responsible for making sure that the organizations we invest in are actually doing what they say they're doing. You would have authority. Your name would be on your work." Silence. "That's a real job," Sandra said. "Yes. Not a gesture, not a—" "Sandra," Claire kept her voice even and warm. "I do not make gestures. I make structures. You would have a real role with real authority and real accountability. If you take the job, I will expect you to do it fully, and I will expect you to tell me when I'm wrong about something. Because you will see things I can't see, and I need people around me who will say so." Another silence. Longer. "I need to talk to my kids," Sandra said finally. "Of course. Can I have until Monday? Take whatever time you need." On Friday, Sandra Torres called back and said yes. She started 3 weeks later. On her first day, she walked into the foundation's office, a real office in a real building, with her actual name on an actual door, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before she went in. Her daughter had insisted on driving her. Her daughter was sitting in the car in the parking garage, probably crying again. Sandra walked through the door. That was the beginning of something. Meanwhile, in a different part of the city, Daniel Whitmore was having a different kind of first day. He had been formally retained as a transition advisor to Whitmore Capital Solutions under the new board structure, the board that the Bennett Trust had installed, comprised of 7 people with records of genuine ethical governance, and not a single one of them a personal friend of his. His role was specific and bounded and involved a great deal of explaining things to people who were now in charge of them, which required him to be in rooms where he had previously been the most important person and be instead one of the less important ones. He had expected this to be humiliating. He had braced for it. It was not humiliating. It was clarifying. The new board chair was a woman named Dr. Eleanor James, 63 years old, who had spent her career in corporate governance reform and who had a particular way of looking at people that made them feel both fully seen and gently accountable. She did not treat Daniel with contempt. She did not treat him with sympathy. She treated him with the precise professional fairness of a person who has decided to evaluate him by what he does from this point forward and has genuinely released her judgment of what came before. He found that harder to handle than contempt would have been. On his second week as transition advisor, he was in a meeting with the operations team going through the restructuring of the internal reporting systems, the systems that had been used to obscure the projection variance, the systems that were being rebuilt from the ground up with transparency requirements that made what he had previously done not just unethical, but structurally impossible going forward. I was explaining how a specific data pipeline had been set up, how the information had flowed or hadn't flowed between divisions. He was explaining it clearly and completely the way he had committed to explaining everything without softening or deflecting. And in the middle of explaining it, he stopped. The room looked at him. "I want to say something," he said. "Not as a procedure, just directly." The room waited. "I built this system this way deliberately," he said. "I want that to be in the record. Not that it was a mistake or an oversight or an error of judgment. I chose it. I understood what I was doing, and I chose it because it was convenient, and because I told myself the ends would justify it, and because—" He paused. "Because I had stopped thinking of the people affected by these decisions as people. They had become numbers in a projection. And when people become numbers in your projection, you stop seeing what you're actually doing to them." Nobody in the room said anything. "I'm not telling you this for absolution," he said. "I'm telling you because the reason these new systems need to exist is not technical. It's human. And if you rebuild the systems without understanding why they failed in the first place, you'll eventually build new ways to fail." He looked around the room. "The reason they failed is that I stopped seeing people. These systems need to be built by people who are committed to never doing that." He looked back at his documents. "That's all," he said. "Let's continue." Dr. Eleanor James, who had been sitting at the back of the room and whom Daniel had not noticed, stood up and left quietly. In the hallway, she called Marcus Webb. "Your assessment of him was accurate," she said. "Which part?" Marcus said. "The part where you said he might actually mean it." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Yes, I think he might." The regulatory process moved through its stages with the grinding, methodical pace of regulatory processes which are designed to be thorough rather than fast. Arthur Gill had been accurate in his timeline. The preliminary inquiry took 5 weeks. During that time, Daniel cooperated fully with every request produced, every document answered, every question. Greg Halston, whose attorney had negotiated a cooperation agreement in the first week, did the same. The determination came on a Tuesday morning, 6 weeks after the Nexum meeting. The SEC issued findings of material misrepresentation, a serious designation carrying significant consequences, but falling short of criminal fraud referral, which the cooperation designation had made possible. Both Daniel and Greg received substantial financial penalties and multi-year bars from certain executive functions. The company's new board structure and governance requirements were formalized as conditions of the resolution. Daniel read the determination in his apartment, the downtown apartment that he had moved into with such satisfaction the morning after the divorce, and that now felt like a place he had been staying rather than a place he lived. He read it twice. He sat with it. He was 49 years old, and he had just lost the right to run a public company for 5 years, and he had paid a financial penalty that would require him to liquidate most of what he had built over 15 years. He sat with all of that. He did not perform his reaction for anyone. He did not call Greg. He did not call his lawyer, who had already been informed. He sat in his apartment and he let it be real, and he thought about what it meant to have arrived at this specific place. I thought about choices. He thought about the map of everything behind him, every moment where he could have turned left and turned right instead. He thought about the man in the beginning who had held on. He thought about Claire's voice on the phone saying he's still in there somewhere. I'd start looking for him. He picked up the phone, not to call a lawyer, not to call Greg. He called his younger brother, a man named Patrick, who lived in Denver and who had 3 kids and who had stopped calling Daniel about 5 years ago when the calls started feeling like obligations rather than conversations. Patrick, who had been a teacher for 12 years and who had exactly none of Daniel's ambition and exactly all of Daniel's original values, the ones that had been there before the ambition replaced them. Patrick picked up on the second ring, which already said something. "Hey," Patrick said, cautious, not cold, but careful. "Hey," Daniel's voice was rough. "I know I'm probably the last person you expected to hear from." "No," Patrick said. "I've been watching the news. I've been wondering if you were going to call." "It took me a while." "I know." A pause. "Dan, are you okay?" And Daniel Whitmore, who had spent 15 years constructing a version of himself that was never not okay, who had treated okay as a minimum performance requirement and anything less as weakness, said, "No, not really, but I think I will be." Patrick exhaled. "Good," he said simply. "That's good." They talked for 2 hours. Not about the company or the regulatory process or the money, about everything else, about the man Daniel had been before the ambition and the man he intended to be on the other side of all of this, about Patrick's kids, a girl who was 9 and obsessed with astronomy, a boy who was 12 and struggling with the thing that 12-year-olds sometimes struggle with, a girl who was 7 and apparently fearless in ways that terrified her parents, about small things, real things. When he hung up, Daniel felt something he had not felt in years. Not relief exactly, not happiness, something quieter and more durable than both of those, something that felt distantly like the beginning of solid ground. He sat in his apartment. He thought about what came next. He thought about the 5-year bar from executive functions, and what a person does with 5 years when the thing they have organized their entire identity around is no longer available to them. He thought about Patrick's classroom. He thought about the employees at Whitmore Capital who had gone to work every day and done their jobs, and who were still there, still going to work on more solid ground now than they had been before. I thought about what Priya Sato had said in a brief conversation with his attorney during the resolution process about the Bennett Foundation's interest in mentorship and business ethics programming. About their need for people who understood from the inside how ethical failure happens in organizations, not to celebrate that failure, but to use the understanding of it to prevent it in others. He thought about it for a long time. Then he pulled up the foundation's website, which James Okafor had built to be clean and direct and unimpressive in the way that genuine things are unimpressive, without the performative language of organizations that care more about seeming good than being good. And he found the contact address, and he wrote an email. He wrote it carefully. He wrote it without self-pity or excessive contrition. He wrote it the way he had been trying to do things since Thursday of the week that changed everything straight and honest and without performance. He said, "I understand that you are building something intended to prevent the kind of failure I participated in. I have a specific and detailed understanding of how that failure happens. I would like to offer that understanding in whatever form is useful, not because I believe I deserve a role in what you're building, but because I believe the knowledge is valuable, and I am currently the person who has it. I will accept whatever response this receives, including no response." He sent it. He put the phone down. He did not expect a response quickly. He had not written it expecting a quick response. He had written it because it was the next honest thing he could do, and he had decided, sitting in an empty meeting room on a Thursday afternoon, looking at the city through glass, that honest things were the only things worth doing. The response came in 4 days. It was from James Okafor, brief, professional, and genuine. It said, "We've been discussing your email. We'd like to have a conversation." Not a commitment, a conversation. "Would you be available next week?" Daniel read it twice. Then he replied, "Yes." He put his phone down and sat with the particular quality of a moment that is small and enormous at the same time. A moment that doesn't announce itself as significant, but that you somehow know with complete certainty is the first step of something real. He had a long way to go. He knew that. He was not under any illusion that an email exchange or a conversation or even a full year of honest behavior erased what the previous years had been. Accountability, he was learning, is not a transaction. You do not deposit enough good behavior into an account until the balance pays off the debt. It is instead a direction, a way of facing. You choose it every day, not once. He chose it that day. He intended to choose it the next day, too. 3 months after the Bennett Foundation for Working Families announced its existence, Claire sat in a community center on the south side of Chicago, watching Sandra Torres present the foundation's first operational integrity report to a room of 40 employees from 3 different companies. Employees who had been invited to attend a workshop on understanding their own financial rights and the protections available to them. Sandra was extraordinary. That was the word that kept arriving in Claire's mind watching her. Not impressive. Impressive was a word for performance. Extraordinary. Sandra Torres had spent 20 years being good at things that other people got credit for, and now she was in a room where the credit was hers, and the room could feel it. She knew how to talk to these people because she was these people. She knew what questions they were afraid to ask because they were the questions she had been afraid to ask. She knew where the gaps in understanding were because she had lived in those gaps. When the session ended and the room was clearing, a man approached Sandra, middle-aged, work-worn hands, the careful posture of someone in an unfamiliar environment, and he said something to her in a low voice that Claire couldn't hear from where she was sitting. Sandra listened. She nodded. She put her hand briefly on the man's arm, the same gesture Claire had made at Sandra's kitchen table, brief and genuine and without ceremony. She said something back to him. The man's shoulders dropped about 2 inches. The specific drop of a person who has been holding something tense and has been given permission to release it. He walked away. Sandra watched him go and then looked across the room and found Claire's eyes, and the expression on her face was not triumph and not pride, and not the self-conscious awareness of being observed doing something good. It was something simpler. The expression of a person who has found the place where what they are and what they do are the same thing. Claire looked back at her and nodded once. Just once. Sandra turned back to the next person waiting to talk to her. On the drive back, Marcus sat beside Claire in the car, and they were quiet for a while, the way they sometimes were, the comfortable quiet of two people who have known each other long enough that silence is a form of conversation. "Your mother," Marcus said finally, "used to say that the best investments are the ones that keep compounding after you've forgotten you made them." Claire looked out the window. "She said that many times." He paused. "I think she meant money, but I think she also meant people." Claire thought about Sandra Torres's hand on the man's arm. She thought about the 2-inch drop in his shoulders. She thought about a 16-year-old girl who wanted to be the kind of lawyer who does what you did. She thought about 412 people going to work on solid ground. She thought about compounding. "Yes," she said. She did. The Foundation's 30-day investments went out on schedule and on target. 3 small businesses in underserved Chicago neighborhoods received their first capital. A woman who had been running a catering operation out of her home for 6 years and had never been able to access the financing to scale it. A man who had built a construction apprenticeship program with no money and extraordinary results. A cooperative childcare center that had been surviving on donations and determination and needed infrastructure to survive on something more stable. Each of them received not just capital, but operational support. People who sat down with them and understood their specific situation and built a plan around what they actually needed, rather than what the standard model assumed they needed. Each of them independently said some version of the same thing when asked what the difference was. They said, "I felt like someone actually listened." That was the architecture. That was what Claire had decided in the coffee shop on Saturday afternoon was the thing she wanted to build. Not just funding, listening, the active, accountable, present quality of attention that says you are real to me. Your situation is real. What you need matters, and I am here to help you get it. She had been invisible for 7 years. She had watched from close range what happens when the people in power stop seeing the people affected by their power. She had felt what it was like to be looked at and not seen, to be sitting across a desk from someone who had decided you were furniture and was simply waiting for you to stop taking up space. She had decided to be the opposite of all of that. Not loudly. Not with speeches or press releases or the performance of goodness that organizations sometimes mistake for goodness itself. Quietly and accountably and consistently, and with the willingness to be wrong and correct and keep going. 6 months after the Nexum meeting, the Foundation had its first cohort of fellows, 15 first-generation college students who had been identified through partnerships with 5 community colleges students who were smart and capable and had been moving through their educations with no resources and no connections, and no one paying sufficient attention to what they might become if they had both. The orientation for the cohort was held on a Saturday morning. Claire attended. She was introduced simply her name, her role, no elaborate biography, and she spoke for about 10 minutes, which was less than people expected and more than enough. She said in part, "The only thing I know for certain about any of you is that someone decided you were worth paying attention to. I hope you will, in whatever you go on to do, pass that decision forward. Notice the people that systems are designed to miss. Be the presence that pays attention. That is the only investment that never stops compounding." She sat down. One of the students, a young woman in the 3rd row, 20 years old, the first in her family to attend college with the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have learned to absorb more than they show, raised her hand. "Can I ask you something?" "Yes," Claire said. "Was there a moment when you almost didn't do any of this, when it would have been easier to just let it go, walk away and not get involved?" The room was quiet. Claire looked at the young woman and thought about the elevator going down from the 32nd floor. She thought about the phone call she had made before she reached the lobby. She thought about the moment in the lobby when she had pressed her hand flat against her sternum and breathed. She thought about the choice, the specific conscious choice to move towards something rather than away from it. "Yes," she said honestly, "there was a moment." "What made you not—" Claire thought about it. Really thought about it in front of the room without hurrying toward an answer that sounded good. "I thought about the people who would be affected if I didn't," she said. people I didn't know, people who had nothing to do with my situation, and I realized that whether I acted or didn't act was going to change things for them either way. The only question was, what kind of change? She paused. So I decided that if I was going to affect people's lives regardless, and I was because that's what having this kind of resource means, then I would choose the direction intentionally. The young woman nodded slowly. And the person who hurt you, she said carefully, how do you separate that from everything else? Claire held the question for a moment. It was the most honest question she had been asked in any room since all of this began. I decided, she said, that what he did to me was real and deserved to be addressed, and that what he did to those employees was real and deserved to be addressed, and that those two things were both true and both mattered, and I could handle them both without letting either one poison the other. She looked at the young woman steadily. Anger is an honest feeling, and it has its place, but I didn't want anger to be the fuel. Anger burns fast and hot and leaves you in the dark when it's done. She paused. I wanted something that would keep burning. The young woman was quiet for a moment. Then, did you find it? Claire looked at the room. She looked at 15 first-generation students who had gotten up on a Saturday morning and come to a building where someone had decided they were worth paying attention to. She thought about Sandra Torres's hand on a stranger's arm. She thought about a catering operation scaling out of someone's home. She thought about a 16-year-old girl who wanted to be the kind of lawyer who does what you did. She thought about her mother's voice. You'll know what to do with it when the time comes. She looked at the young woman in the third row. Yes, she said, I found it. The room exhaled. And Claire Bennett, the woman who had spent 7 years making herself invisible so she could know something true, who had sat across a desk from a man who laughed at her value and signed the papers he put in front of her and walked out without looking back, who had spent 8 extraordinary days unfolding everything she had hidden and pointing it like an instrument at the people who needed it most. Claire Bennett looked out at the room she had built and the people she had chosen and the work that was only just beginning, and she understood with the complete and quiet certainty of a woman who has stopped performing and started living that this was what she had been made for. Not the wealth, not the power, not the moment in the meeting room when Daniel Whitmore's face changed. This, the room, the work, the people. This was what she had been made for, and she had arrived, and she was not going anywhere. The woman everyone had underestimated had always been the most powerful person in the room. She simply no longer needed anyone else to know it. She knew it herself,